Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, everyone. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Indigenous peoples and local communities representatives, and all invited guests. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second Global Thematic Dialogue for Indigenous peoples and local communities on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So you are all welcome, and I really appreciate your connecting and joining us. To open this dialogue, as it is customary to Indigenous peoples, we'll have an Indigenous a prayer to welcome participants. And for this, I would like to invite Tata Felix Sarasua from Amaya, spiritual guide from Guatemala. Mr. Sarasua, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen and please speak once it's turned blue. Mr. Sarasua, please go ahead.
Hermano Sarasua, si puede apretar el botón de levantar la mano.
Can you turn on or raise your hand so that we can add you to the speakers list? It's the button at the bottom of your screen. Brother Felix, could you please raise your hand so that we can identify you in the speakers list, please?
Anyone who can help him will probably connect. Mr. Sarasua, is he with us or probably the connection?
Yeah, I think we don't have him with us.
Maybe Mr. Ramiro, co-chair, if you could assist, or Juliana to talk to him.
Hermano Ramiro, ¿podría tal vez usted darnos unas palabras de...
Ramiro, maybe you can start with some opening remarks. Please, Brother Ramiro, can you raise your hand so that we can give you the floor? Brother Ramiro, please, could you... Here I am talking with Felix, and now the system is asking him for a password. Therefore, he's trying to reconnect. Maybe we can move forward and then come back to the prayer. I don't know.
Maybe this is to the next. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, distinguished delegates, as we have technical problems with our, spiritual leader from Maya, we will just continue, and we apologize for that. And I hope you can all understand technology is an issue everywhere. I would now like to give the floor to Madam Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, for her welcoming remarks. Executive Secretary, you have the floor please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen and please speak. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see me.
Yeah.
No?
No, not right now. You see the screen has multiple places.
Yeah.
So maybe here.
Camera on here. On your one.
Madame Elizabeth, just stop sharing your screen and we'll be able to see your camera.
Please, and the four icons on your left, up.
Yes.
The first one, click and the first one from the device, a little bit up.
That's the one, and then I see camera off, FaceTime camera.
Could you try the icon on the left of that icon? Select the one that is there. Please press select. Go up, a little bit up. Next to that one, next to the one that is in red.
Yes. That's the one I've selected.
No.
No?
The one which is the last one.
The last one in red, please press the one that is in red.
Oh.
So we can turn it off the screen share. There you go.
Yes, there you go.
Perfect. Indeed, technology.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Always good to see you, despite the fact that we are seeing each other virtually. Distinguished participants, representatives of the world indigenous peoples and local communities, dear friends, let me start by thanking you for, unfortunately, I was looking forward for the indigenous ceremony, which always welcomes us, and I hope we'll still have that. But it is my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to you all, and that I thank you also for joining us electronically from various parts of the world. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Campaign for Nature for their generous support in the realization of this second dialogue in virtual mode. Due to the ongoing COVID pandemic, today's dialogue is being held during some very challenging and difficult times we all face. And yet, despite being significantly affected by the pandemic, your efforts to protect nature remains tirelessly. Indigenous peoples and local communities have demonstrated great resilience through the collective and local actions being taken in your territories, lands, and waters. Your collective and local efforts based on your sustainable lifestyles contribute significantly to each of the three objectives of the conventions, namely conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing. And importantly so, your coherent actions taken at local levels are not disconnected from your efforts at international level. I congratulate you for successfully completing your regional discussions over the last month on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, some of which I had the privilege also to attend and participate. We look forward to hearing the outcomes of all these regional dialogues as we move forward. The new Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will inevitably impact your lives and well-being. Let us make sure that it is a positive impact. Accordingly, your views and aspirations for the future are needed to assist humanity in achieving the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. As you know, next year, the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention will hopefully adopt the new Global Biodiversity Framework. This will be a significant stepping stone towards making this vision a reality. The 14th Conference of the Parties adopted an intense process for the preparation of the new framework, and this process remains in place despite the COVID-19 pandemic. In August this year, a peer review of documents in the preparation for the 24th meeting of the subsidiary body on science, technology, and technological advice was conducted, and Indigenous peoples and local communities made a comprehensive submissions on this topic. That same month, the updated zero draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework was published. The updated zero draft, while still work in progress, is still a significant step forward towards the new framework. In preparation for the upcoming meetings under the convention, today's dialogue is an opportunity for you to reflect and build global messages on these recent developments. I cannot overemphasize the importance, therefore, of this meeting. I am pleased to note that we have considerable number of Indigenous peoples' local communities participating in these critical discussions. Delighted. If we are to achieve by 2050 vision of the Convention of Living in Harmony with Nature, it is critical that we harness the power of the collective and local actions of the world's Indigenous peoples and local communities. The Convention needs to ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities are valued partners in shaping the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to help us achieve a more sustainable future for us all. Let us make sure that your optimism, perhaps now needed more than ever before, is embodied in the new Global Biodiversity Framework. I wish you all the best in your deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Aruma Mrema, for those welcoming remarks. I also want to thank you for being with us in the previous events, including the launch of the IPLC's regional webinars, and your continuous messages and support in our work. And we really do appreciate very much, and thank you so much for that. I now declare the session open, as we've already had our opening message. I will make my opening remarks. First, I wish to thank the Executive Secretary again and our staff for the excellent preparation made for this dialogue. It's taken quite a lot of time because of the technical part of it, but we are really grateful with this great work. I wish to thank the 7 IFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity Regional Coordinators, distributed accordingly to the 7 eco-cultural indigenous regions. Your work is in organizing your regional dialogue is impressive. And me and my co-chair are happy that the work has gone quite well and the coordination has been very well. And we hope that the reports that we get are going to be positive, and really we look forward for it. And do thank my co-chair again for the advice and also support. As you know, we operate as one big team. Today, the dialogue will provide an opportunity to consider the updated zero draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the proposed draft monitoring framework in order to prepare for the next step in the negotiations proposed at SABSTA 24. We indeed have a demanding task for this meeting. Agenda items that we need to complete are: first, we need to engage in dialogue to develop global and concrete messages for the Global Biodiversity Framework process under Agenda Item 5. And second, we need to communicate those messages to the chairperson of the SABSTA 24, the chairperson of the SBI 3, and the co-chairs of the working group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under Agenda Item 6. The dialogue is open to representatives of Indigenous peoples and local communities. The work of the dialogue takes place in 2-hour sessions over 3 days, from 1st today to the 3rd of December 2020. This is a 6-hour meeting. The co-chairs expect to use all the time allocated to this dialogue. The dialogue will be conducted in English with informal interpretation in Spanish, French, and Russian. You may choose the language of your choice by clicking on the floor language button at the top of your screen, and the Secretariat will help us in explaining that later. You have all received the user's guide on how this platform works. These platforms allows all delegates to activate their video and microphone. This platform is best run on Google Chrome, as we are told by the Secretariat. And when you first logged in, the system could make prompted you to activate your microphone and camera. If you have not done so, please log out and re-enter the conference room as you were told earlier on. So the chair I'll be calling you when it's time for you to speak. And once that is done, the speaker button will turn blue, and then press the speaker button and then you speak. And so you'll hear that same message several times when the speakers do speak, but please take it that we have to keep on learning and understanding it. The opening session today and the final session on 3rd of December from 9 to 10 a.m. are public sessions. Comments and stakeholders are invited to follow the second dialogue in the CBD YouTube. So thank you for that, and I hope that we'll be able to catch up with all the information. We are happy that we have the Secretariat throughout with us. In case of any problem, they will be able to help us. And now we are pleased to have with us Mr. Jashus Wu, who will address us in preparation for the Nature and Culture Summit. And sorry if I pronounce your name wrongly, because it's a very difficult name. Mr. Wu, you have the floor. And please press the button again, raise your hand, button left on your screen to be given the floor and speak. Button. You're welcome.
Hi, good morning, good evening from China, and welcome to Nature Culture Summit and during the COP15 in Yunnan province. So I'd like to introduce the Yunnan province and where the Kunming city are located. And we are in between connecting Tibetan Plateau, the Asia Water Tower, to mainland Southeast Asia. And we are located in the East Himalaya region, where they have the most beautiful biological diversity and also cultural diversity. In China, this province regards the highest biological and also cultural diversity. So we have 25 ethnic groups and accounting for 1/3 of the total population. We are sitting upstream Salween, Mekong, and the Red River, upstream Yangtze River, so very diverse, dynamic landscape in this region. And also, on behalf of the local committee, particularly nature and culture, and on behalf of the local government, welcome everyone, particularly our indigenous people delegation. So if you have any particular request for how we organize nature culture, please write to me, and also I'll try my best to serve you. So the Nature and Culture Summit event will take only 2 days, but we are thinking 2 + 3 days. So we try to have another speed event together with the indigenous people in Honghe, upstream of Red River. So which 3 days allowed our indigenous delegation to have more interaction directly with the Chinese indigenous people. And we try to formulate the Yunnan Declaration, particularly for enhanced biological diversity and the cultural diversity together. So also our team try our best to develop a follow-up action and particularly for indigenous community, and also for Chinese government to take over from whatever the indigenous community was endorsed. So on this regards, I'd like to thank and for give opportunity for us to organize the big events, nature and the culture summit. And also please do contact with me and for what you like to see about China and how you interact with the indigenous community. And so I'm ready to serve you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is really looking like I can almost see where that is. And thank you so much for that information. And we look forward to the success out there. Now, before we continue,
just would like to inform you that Mr. Felix is with us.
Yes, that's where I want to call him to speak. So could I give Mr. Sarasua to speak to us? Please press the button. Please press the button. Raise your hand and then you'll have the floor.
Buenos días. Bien, buenos días.
Hermano Felix.
Brother Felix, we're not able to listen to you.
¿Sí me escucha?
Now?
Ahora sí.
Yes. Now.
La imagen, no sé si está bien.
I'm not sure whether you can see my screen. On the left side of your screen, you can see a button where you can share your screen. An arrow, yes, on the left side at the bottom, next to the raise hand button, there you have an arrow or if not, you can still guide us.
Fíjese que, bueno, no sé si será necesaria la imagen.
No, sí, por favor.
Va, muy bien.
Okay.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone.
No enfoca la pantalla bien.
I think I'm not able to share my screen.
Este día, déjenme ponerlos en contexto, este día.
Today,
Cuenta maya del tiempo.
in the Mayan calendar,
el día que se dedica al aire, al sagrado
we
aire.
dedicate this day to the air, to the sacred air.
Bukuk-ik, o sea,
Bukuk-ik
aire.
in Maya is
Entonces,
seventh air.
Nuestra invocación, todas nuestras acciones,
Our
digamos,
call,
al día
prayers,
deben
and
estar
actions
orientadas
today
hacia
has to
el
be
sagrado aire,
oriented towards
agradecerle al aire,
sacred
pues, por todo,
air.
porque
We
un
have
solo
to
cuerpo
thank
que nos
air
une, que nos
for
siente,
that
nos escucha.
soul body that
Este día
feels us,
también
hears
es
us.
dedicado a nuestro ser espiritual, ¿verdad?
Today is also dedicated to our spiritual self, human beings, nature, all elements in the universe have a soul. Sun, the moon, each star and stone has a spirit, a soul. We know that the stones are part of the body of the earth. So today is a day to reflect on ourself, that nature that directs our body. Today is a special day to raise our voices, ideas, expressions. It is a good day for this dialogue. It's on diversity. The wind is a sacred. element with
que siempre
whom we need to
nos mantenga vivos
talk
y mantenga vivo
to
todo y
keep
nos
us
mantenga
alive.
conectados, igual que
And
la madre tierra, elemento que nos mantiene unidos,
as Mother
es igual al
Earth,
sagrado aire.
it helps us be
Entonces, con el
united.
permiso de los presentes, las
So, with
autoridades,
all
a
your
los
permission
abuelos y abuelas, los mayores
and the
presentes,
permission of
vamos
our
a pedir su
ancestors,
picado
brothers and
al
sisters,
sagrado
all
aire, a
of
los
you
abuelos, abuelas
present in
ancestros que
this
nos
meeting,
permitan
we will ask
esta
our
reunión, esta actividad
ancestors
que
to
tenga
allow
lugar hoy.
us held this meeting.
Al creador y formador del
We
universo,
will ask
al sagrado
the
guardián del
creator of
aire,
the
al
universe,
sagrado
the
elemento aire, que nos permita
sacred
entonces
air,
tiempo, espacio que vamos
to
a
give
estar
us this
comunicados,
time and
cada hermano,
space
hermano desde el lugar donde está, tal vez su lugar
wherever
de
we
trabajo,
are,
tal vez humilde
maybe
morada,
at work
en su lugar de
or
origen.
at home,
Hagan el favor al
in
sagrado
your
de mantener
place
esa
of birth.
comunicación que es tan
Please, let's
necesaria
keep
para poder
open this
comunicarnos,
communication
poder
that is
dialogar.
so
Nosotros
important
necesitamos pues de estos aparatos para poder comunicarnos, pero ustedes, abuelos,
to
abuelas, al sagrado aire,
really be
en un solo
able
instante
to
nos escucha,
communicate. But
nos siente.
you, sacred
Permítanos
air, you
entonces que
can
nuestro ser
listen
espiritual
our
fluya,
voices every time.
fluya a
Let us
través del viento,
our
fluya a través del
spiritual self
espacio
to flow
y
through
podamos
the
tener esa
air,
comunicación
through
en
the
armonía
wind,
con todos.
and to
Permitan
communicate
entonces
throughout all
nuestras
our
ideas expresadas a
energies.
través de la
Let
palabra
us
ser escuchados
express
primero
our
por ustedes,
ideas
abuelos, abuelas,
clearly. First of
que
all,
después pues llegue al corazón
this message
de
should
cada
be
uno
sent
de
to
los
all of you
participantes.
ancestors, but also
¿Para
to
qué?
the
Para que
heart
entienda
of each of the
entonces a la
participants
buena
so that they
comunicación,
understand
entienda
that
nuestras ideas, lo que hay en nuestro
our
corazón, nuestros
ideas
pensamientos
and what
y
is in
nuestras
our
experiencias
heart and
también,
own
no tanto todos los
experiences,
que participamos, principalmente los
all
participantes, nuestras experiencias vividas
participants
sean de beneficio para
share
todos.
their life
Hagan el favor
experiences
entonces,
and
abuelas y
let
abuelos,
them be of
permítanos,
benefit to all.
denos ese permiso, permítanos entonces
Give
este
us
momento para
then
poder comunicarnos, pidiendo siempre la guía, la
grandparents
orientación de ustedes.
that
Al
protection.
final,
With
todos
your
estemos felices, todos
guidance,
estemos
we
contentos,
will
igual
all
el
be
corazón de
happy.
ustedes, abuelos y abuelas. Con permiso entonces, Anila Mateo Xavier Rukushka, Rukushuleu, Rukush. Que todo sea éxito, triunfo al final.
Thank you. A success for this event and for all of us.
Thank you very much, Sua, and thank you for giving us that blessing. Sorry for the interruption with the connection earlier on, but we do appreciate your effort. As part of the opening session, dear delegates, colleagues, indigenous peoples, and local communities, I would like to invite Ms. Camila Sapeda, who is the Director General of the Global Affairs and CBD National Focal Point of the Government of Mexico, to present the outcome of the Indigenous Peoples Dialogue on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. Ms. Abeda, you have the floor. Please press the button, raise hand button at the bottom of the left and of your screen, and please speak when you're ready. You're welcome. Perfect.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me congratulate the Convention on Biological Diversity for organizing this important event. And we do believe the importance of effective participation of Indigenous people and local communities to have successful processes to stop biodiversity loss, especially in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In the same line of thought, the governments of Mexico and Canada co-organized an Indigenous Peoples Dialogue on biodiversity, desertification, and climate change, with the aim to better understand their perspectives and incorporate their views in the three Rio Conventions. We had this dialogue over 4 consecutive weeks and included sessions focused on climate change, nature-based solutions, desertification, and of course, biodiversity. We invited Indigenous representatives from all the continents, and we had over 40 representatives to discuss each topic. And the third out of 9 sessions was entirely focused on gathering their perspective on biodiversity. Now, the commitment of the government of Mexico as a party to the CBD is to make sure that the main conclusions of this session are incorporated into the works of the convention and the international negotiations of the Post-2020 Framework. Here, I would like to express our sincere thanks to the CBD Executive Secretary, Madame Elizabeth Maruma, for her participation and key message delivers as she introduced this session. And we were very, very adamant on that traditional custodians of biodiversity, waters and lands are important, and her personal committing to recognize the contributions of the indigenous peoples to the 3 CDB's objectives. Next slide, please. As I'm sorry, but I did already said that. Next slide, please. The biodiversity session was truly interesting, and we had 3 fantastic speakers. We had Mrs. Lucy Mulenkei, co-founder and co-president of the Indigenous Women's Network on Biodiversity. We had Mr. Ramiro Botzin, who's co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and Mr. Estebancio Castro, participant of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And we focused our discussion in 3 main topics: the Aichi targets, Post-2020 Framework, and the incorporation of traditional knowledge of the CBD. Next slide, please. From the indigenous people's perspective, we ask why were the IG targets not met? And what we hear is that despite IG targets not being fully achieved, it is important to notice that many countries made a great effort to meet them. However, one of the reasons these targets were failed was the lack of full and effective indigenous people's participation in all activities. We are convinced that you are better off protecting forests than natural protector areas, and these contributions were not properly recognized in the rationale of the IG targets. Indigenous peoples and local communities did rise to the challenge better than any other of protecting land through traditional knowledge and sustainable development. So we believe that they can only succeed if participatory approaches and human rights approaches are implemented. Particularly during COVID-19 times, it also became clearer than ever that the importance of food sovereignty for the indigenous peoples' communities should have been included in the IG targets, making sure resources are sent directly to their communities. Next slide, please. So how can the perspectives of indigenous peoples toward nature be effectively reflected in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? So, I mean, there has to be a full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. And it does, for that, it does not only mean having them in the room, but to allow them to share their knowledge and experiences during the process and making efforts to include them in the implementation process. For example, translating goals to their languages. We also heard that there must be a goal, a target on indigenous people and local communities per se at the new Global Biodiversity Framework. And it must be in line with the international framework and fully recognizing rights. Also, there must be policy commitments to include indigenous people and local communities in biodiversity national plans. But above all, this new global framework must consider how to measure and enhance effort to measure their contributions by including specific indicators. Next slide, please. And so how can we ensure that traditional knowledge is maintained in the youngest and the generations to come? How can traditional practices be mainstreamed into biodiversity management policies? So first of all is that indigenous peoples are creating their own needs protocols to protect biodiversity. So the Nagoya Protocol should be implemented according to IP communities' needs and also with a human rights approach. To keep traditional knowledge, there must be a territory for them to protect and pass on their knowledge. Therefore, a human rights approach and traditional knowledge are linked and indivisible, and contribute to both stop climate change and biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. So the key conclusions from this session's dialogue is that a human rights approach is necessary for Indigenous people to be able to continue developing and transferring their traditional knowledge in their territories, stopping climate change and biodiversity loss. Indigenous people, we heard, have three goals for the negotiation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework must not harm Indigenous people's rights. Second, Indigenous people's perspective must be included in all the framework. And third, there should be a specific Indigenous people and local communities target. And these new indicators for the post-global framework must include ways to measure their involvement in each target. And a final conclusion is that there is a concern on how target 12 on the current draft zero is drafted, as it might read as if Indigenous peoples must share the traditional knowledge with societies. And this is against the Nagoya Protocol principle of Indigenous people's consent before any sharing happens. So they've asked for this goal to be redrafted. We're very happy to keep pushing these conclusions throughout negotiations and share all of their perspectives that have enriched our negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zebeda, for that summary. And I think this is really a great opportunity that the Mexican government, your government, was able to give Indigenous people. And we were really very happy because the sessions were many and many Indigenous people were able to participate. Thank you again, and take our greetings and our appreciation to the headquarters. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, now we go to organizational matters. With that intervention, we close agenda item 1, and now we move to agenda item 2, which is the organizational matter. The IFB co-chair will provide over the meeting, including the adoption of this agenda and the organization of work. The IFB regional coordinators, along with Ms. Viviana Figueroa and Ms. Adija Adamu, who have been nominated to serve as rapporteurs. The rapporteurs and co-chairpersons of the IFB will form a drafting committee to draft the main messages, which will be adopted by the IPLCs, the Indigenous peoples and local communities participants, by consensus on the morning of the last day. The main messages will be annexed to the report of the meeting, so they can be conveyed in the SAPSA 24, SBI 3, and the third open-ended working group on the post-2020. I'm sure most of you already have seen the agenda for the dialogue that has been published at the CBD website for the meeting as CBD /post2020/WS/2020/5/1, prepared by the Executive Secretary in consultation with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And do urge you all to keep all the time to the website as you get updated information every other time. And I hope there is no other additional for the agenda. And so the agenda is adopted, and we close this agenda item. So now we go to update of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now I open this agenda item 3, which is update of that of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Under this agenda item, we will listen to a 5-minute presentation from the Secretariat, who will provide an update on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework process. And that will be done by Kapak Kode. You have the floor. And since you are an expert in technology, please do raise your hand button, and on the left-hand side, of course, and then you can speak. Hey, Kapak, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to everyone, and thank you for connecting with us today. Next slide, please. The Convention on Biological Diversity is a legal binding international treaty with three main objectives: conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of its component, and fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from the use of genetic resources. The Convention provides conservation and protection to plants, animal, microorganisms, and their ecosystem, but it also refers to the peoples and their needs, such as food security, medicine, clean air, fresh water, housing, and environmental health. Under the CBD, IPLC's contributions are recognized in the three objectives of the Convention. Article 8J provides protection to traditional knowledge, and Article 10C protects protection for customary use, sustainable of biodiversity. Next slide. Thank you. In 2011, the parties of the convention adopted the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020, a 10-year framework for action for all countries, indigenous people and local communities, and stakeholders to safeguard biodiversity. Next slide. This plan consists in 20 targets. All of them were relevant for indigenous people, including mainly target 11, 14, 16, 18, which address directly the protection of traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices of relevant indigenous people and local communities. As the strategic plan concludes this year, the Conference of Parties, the governing body of the convention, in its upcoming 15th session, will adopt a new global biodiversity framework as a decisive step toward the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. Next slide. COP14 established the working group on the Global Biodiversity Framework with the mandate to support the preparation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It has two co-chairs that have been appointed, Mr. Francis Owanda from Uganda and Mr. Basil Van Hebron from Canada. 3 meetings are planned for the working group, which 2 of them had already taken place, with the first one in Nairobi, August 2019, and in Rome in February 2020 this year. There is one upcoming meeting that will take place, and this third meeting will present its draft to COP15 for its adoption. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. The updated Zero draft released on August 15 by the co-chairs, it takes into account the outcomes of the second meeting of the working group in February 2020, as well as submissions received in response to the notification 2019-108 that invite to present submissions in views of possible target indicators baseline for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This draft will be further updated to take into account the outcomes of the 24th meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice, and the 3rd meeting of the subsidiary on implementation, as well the advice from the thematic consultations, and this draft will be available 6 weeks prior to the meeting, to the 3rd meeting of the working group and its last meeting. As we can see, the current updated Zero draft have 20 targets, which are grouped in 3 sections. A, reduce threat of biological diversity. B, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. And the third one, tools and solutions for the development and integration. We can see also that milestones for 2030 are considered, as well the goals for 2015. This negotiation is setting an important process as it marks the next path for the next 20 and 30 years ahead of us. Next slide. The way forward and next year. COP14 adopted an intensive program for preparation of the new framework, which remains and adapts during COVID-15. The Global Biodiversity Framework process is very much alive. In August, the peer review of the documents in preparation for SABSTA 24 was conducted. IPLC made a comprehensive substantive contribution and submission. In August, the updated zero draft was published. Again, a text that is being in progress. It's a significant step forward the new framework. Today, parties of the convention are discussing the next steps in this context. And it's not an easy discussion. This discussion includes having virtual or physical meetings, or maybe a hybrid of those where some delegates could connect virtually and others physically. This discussion also involves formal and informal meetings. Informal meetings as preparations for the negotiations, which of course play an important role in these discussions. And well, at this stage, parties are discussing these options. Next slide, please. And it's also under the consideration of the parties that SABSTA 24 might meet in the first quarter of next year. The SABSTA is expected to review the documents on the components of goals and targets, but mainly the elements for monitoring framework and indicators, and to make recommendations to the third meeting of the working group on the post-2020. Next slide, please. Before I conclude, I think that I just would like to highlight that the roadmap toward the new framework is very clear. We have 3 meetings ahead of us: SABSTA 24, SBI 3, and the third meeting of the working group. Then they will be submitted the draft for the COP decision. In this context, your views, aspirations, and messages are very important in this process. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Kapak, and thank you for that summary and taking us through the journey. We appreciate very much. And now I would like to move to agenda item 4, presentations by Indigenous peoples and local communities on the outcome of the regional webinars. Under this agenda item, the IFB regional coordinators or their representatives from the 7 socio-cultural regions and a representative of the IWBN will present, that's the Indigenous Women and Biodiversity Network, will present the outcomes from their meetings. Finally, we will listen to a presentation with the main topics for IPLCs on the Global Biodiversity Framework. In the interest of time, each presentation should not be longer than 5 minutes. I will raise my hand to indicate when there is 1 minute left. And I will also ask the secretary to help me in case you may not see my hand very easily. Now, I will ask the secretariat to upload the presentation so that everyone can see it. And let us wait for a few minutes for that, and then we can go ahead with the first presenter, who is from Africa. So when the upload is ready, please do say, yeah. I think it's already set up there. It's gone again.
Just give us 1 second.
Okay, perfect.
I can share from my end.
Oh, okay. Let's see who's doing it.
Madam
Okay.
Chair, can you confirm that it's it?
We can go ahead now.
Yes.
Okay. The presentation now is viewed in one of those small videos you can see right there. And our first presentation is a report from African region. I would now like to to give the floor to Ms. Adija Adamu to present the outcome from the dialogue in Africa. And please, Adija, you're welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Co-Chair. Thank you for giving me the floor. The meeting, the regional dialogue meeting in Africa took place on the 23rd of November with a total participants of 71 that were expected, but due to connection issues, only about 35 were connected and attended the meeting to the end. In the course of the meeting, presentations from SCDD, IPs, LBOs, and IIFP secretariat were presented, and the presentations were about the zero draft in general and focused on targets that concerns IPLCs. The African IPLCs were satisfied with the issues raised during the discussion on the zero draft, and the following key issues were highlighted: the domestication and implementation of international instruments, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Nagoya Protocol. Also, issues of land tenure were discussed, and the free and prior informed consent of the ABS. In addition, the indigenous people, next slide. Please. In addition, the recommendations from indigenous people were to ensure that traditional knowledge should be key and indigenous people should be fully informed in the making process with respect of the free, prior, and informed consent. To guarantee that states parties should include in their national policies the Nagoya Protocol to regulate the issues of protected areas and wildlife, to take responsibility and recognitions of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities to their ancestral land as natural conservationists and protectors of biodiversity, to ensure a human rights-based approach is used to prevent the violation of IPLC's rights, and they must be fully involved, to protect technical support, to provide technical support and capacity building for IPLCs, especially indigenous women and youth. And finally, IPLCs of Africa support IIFB general recommendation on the zero draft. In conclusion, the IPLCs of Africa region is looking forward in achieving the 2020 mission and 2050 vision that is living in harmony with nature. Thank you, Mr. Koch.
Thank you very much, Adamu, and thank you for keeping time. And that's very, very good. Let's now move on to the next region. And I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Lakpa Nur Shapa to present the outcomes from Asia dialogue. Mr. Nuri, you have the floor. Please press the raise your hand button on the bottom left of your screen to be given the floor and speak. Button to the bottom right of your screen, and then you can speak as soon as you're ready. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much. The Asia Regional Consultation on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework was organized by Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and Indigenous Women Biodiversity Network on 30th of November. 35 indigenous sisters and brothers from 12 countries in Asia actively participated throughout the consultation. Thanks to the IFB co-chairs, Lucy and Ramiro, who participated in the opening sessions of the consultation. As the number of participants were new to the process of post-2020, we organized our consultations in two parts. The first part of the consultation focused on information sharing and raising awareness on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, thanks to Kapaz of the CBD Secretariat, Joji of the Forest Peoples Program, Eduardo, IPBES Global Assessment Report Coordinating Lead Author, and Tom of the Rights and Resource Initiative for contributing to this session. One key and common message that came out from the first part is exactly what the delegation from the Mexican government was stressing on, that strategy plan for biodiversity and IT targets did not harness the powers of indigenous knowledge, local actions, and contribution of indigenous peoples, leading to underachievement of all the IT biodiversity targets. Therefore, recognition of indigenous peoples, indigenous women and youth as major partners in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, including the protection of indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, are crucial to achieve the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Can you go to the next slide, please? In the second part of the consultation, participants were divided into three groups per sub-region to go through the draft text of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The key observations and recommendations that emerge from the group work are, can we go to the next slide, please?
Apologies, our next slide with Arctic region.
Okay. We acknowledge the reference to indigenous peoples, which is 6 times in the document, traditional knowledge, which is 3 times in the document, including the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, and rights-based approach in the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We also acknowledge the urgency of the transformative actions, which is highlighted in the purpose of the current text. However, we would like to make the following key recommendations to further strengthen the framework. Add a new target explicitly focusing on the protection, safety, and access to justice of indigenous peoples' human rights defenders, including indigenous human rights defenders who are defending their homes, forests, and rivers against the climate and biodiversity destructive industries. Add a new target explicitly focusing on the legal recognition, respect, and promotion of indigenous knowledge systems, innovation practices, and technology. Ensure legal recognition of indigenous peoples' lands, waters, and territories, as well as their customary laws and practices. Indigenous food systems is the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples and the source of livelihoods, biodiversity, and well-being of indigenous peoples. It has played key roles in many communities to combat the challenges posed by COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, it is very important to recognize, protect, and promote indigenous food systems, including the explicit reference to food sovereignty in the framework. Indigenous women are the holders of knowledge and practitioners of traditional livelihoods and resource management, who play a vital role in the transmission of knowledge and values to younger generation. Therefore, the roles and contribution of indigenous women should be explicitly acknowledged and highlighted. The textual proposals on the 2030 action targets, implementation support, and other sections of the document has been submitted to the IAFB because we really went by text during our consultations. So in the end of the consultations, we discuss among ourselves, our brothers and sisters, like the plan for 2021. So what do we do? We contemplated and discussed that all of us should continue to engage with governments, with indigenous peoples and communities in the ground to dialogue on post-2020 with relevant actors. So we'll continue to engage with IAFB and relevant actors. Thank you very much. Lucy, over to you.
Time on that. Thank you again very much. I think you had really very good dialogue over there. So now let me move to I would like to call upon my co-chair, Mr. Ramiro Patsin, to present the outcome from Central and South America and the Caribbean dialogue. Please, Mr. Ramiro, press your button and raise your hand and continue so that you are able to be given. Please go ahead, co-chair.
Gracias.
Thank you, Lucy. A pleasure to greet you again.
It is a pleasure to be sharing with you what we have been discussing in Latin America. The call was sent through the Abajala Indigenous Forum with SICA, the Mesoamerican Central Unit of COICA, CAOI, among others, with coordination with Indigenous Fund of Latin America. We prepare events the 10th, 11th, and 12th of November. We held 3 dialogues. There were 2 events where we had the open dialogues on indigenous people's issues, and a third dialogue where we discussed with states. We have Mexico, Guatemala, Panama, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Colombia. Around 6,000 people were part of this 3 day dialogue. And the main recommendations that were taken away from these meetings were the land tenure of indigenous people, a strengthening of that specific tenure, and probably one of the important items that were considered was a change of paradigm regarding conservation. We should try to think on the management use based on the indigenous cosmovision so that we can really preserve our nature and biodiversity, to protect traditional knowledge and the ways of life of indigenous people. Maybe you can share the next slide. The different recommendations for Target 12 was to include biocultural protocols, participatory protocols on focus on rights of indigenous people. On Target 18, you also refer to the support of indigenous people with specific resource allocation to have a full participation and effective participations of the IPLCs, and supporting the different knowledge and scientific institutions. We need to include her perspective on the monitoring and creation of awareness and policy making processes. And we also talk on the creation of a new target on traditional knowledge. For Latin American peoples, it is important to work on the post-2020 agenda, and the plan should be only possible if promote respect, indigenous peoples respect that are already under other different documentation at international level and also within the CBD. Thank you, Ramiro.
And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Kunbrit Reta to present the outcome from the Arctic Dialogue. Kunbrit, please go ahead, press the raise your hand button on the bottom left of your screen to be given the floor.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Arctic region met in 4 online sessions during November. That was 9th, 10th, 23rd, and 30th. That is yesterday. 4 sessions altogether. We spent 14 hours together. The participants represented the Inuit Nunat and Sapmi through Inuit Circumpolar Council, Sami Council, and the Sami parliaments in Norway and Sweden. Usually, Finland also attends is part of our caucus, but they were not able to attend during this month. We have found it very useful to devote time to focus on the Global Biodiversity Framework process. We have mainly discussed our way through the updated Zero draft. So thank you to the IIFB for initiating the idea to have a series of webinars. The views and recommendations presented here are quite brief, and we expect to continue the working method and in working through the documents also in the new year and until we can meet again. So we have quite some comments in the writing that we will bring with us when we are discussing the documents at the next junction. So about the main views and change, actually, worldview maybe. The Zero Draft calls for transformative change at one hand. And as we all know, the IPBES global assessment released in 2019 recognized indigenous peoples to be among those having solutions to reduce nature loss at the other hand. We, the indigenous peoples in the Arctic, too, see the need for transformative change in the way the world is treating the nature. From our perspective, we believe our worldview, values, holistic approach holds solutions. To activate these solutions, we can and want to contribute to the transformative change called for. In general, however, we find that the Zero Draft still has a way to go to be that change. To improve and to close the distance we feel it is creating between nature and humans, or nature and culture in other terms, several changes could be applied. We think it would be important to recognize humans as part of the ecosystem. The transformative change should focus on equity and building equitable processes for the ethical engagement of indigenous peoples, focus on indigenous peoples management and customary sustainable use. The transformative change for us means equitable involvement of indigenous knowledge and the greater need for recognition of indigenous peoples' knowledge and solutions that can be guided by indigenous communities. Dear audience, while parks and green spaces are important for people, for us as indigenous peoples in the Arctic, it is about food security and food sovereignty, the essence of our cultures. While we at times are challenged by connectivity in our communities located in the 6 Arctic states being among the richest countries in the world, we find it at times also challenging to keep up with all these important processes that we are in now. And not least, we find it challenging to get our messages across fully to the Global Biodiversity Framework documents, among so many other views, voices, decisions, and processes. We therefore are very hopeful that conducting this second Indigenous peoples and local communities dialogue will help highlighting our important messages from the Arctic and the Global Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Network to the Global Biodiversity Framework process. So next slide, please. Is there a next slide? Yeah, I had sent a quite different slide, but yeah, so okay. So we have many recommendations, as I said in the introductory, in the text that we are ready to share in the further future work. The recommendations in text could be summarized in 3 sentences that has elevated from our discussions, or maybe I could say that has guided our discussions, or they stick out. And that is equal and equitable involvement of indigenous knowledge and indigenous knowledge holders. And it was mentioned also earlier that the recognition of indigenous people's rights and safeguards for ensuring the indigenous people's rights throughout the documents. And with that comes also to ensure that targets don't have a negative, that some targets that are implemented don't in the next round have negative impacts on indigenous peoples and local communities. And we see the need to work further on indicators. While we have already recognized brilliant indicators, we need to, we call for a process to further refine and identify indicators that match the new framework. So that was in general what we have been discussing very deeply over 14 hours. So thank you, and over to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Gunn-Britt, and thank you very to see how much you have really discussed. And I like the way you've put on the final recommendations and also encouraging that the work has to be taken forward. And indeed, we are glad that we can all be able to discuss together and bring these recommendations. And now I move on to Russia, the block there. I would like to give the floor to Paulina Shurubeva, to present the outcome from the Central and Eastern Europe. That's Russia, Federation, Central Asia, and the other areas which I can't pronounce very well. And Paulina, please, you have the floor. You're ready.
Thank you,
there.
Lucy.
Thank you.
Yes.
I will speak in Russian. Thank you, Lucy. In the Russian Federation, we hosted 4 webinars that lasted from the end of October to the end of November. They were organized by the Center for Support of Indigenous People of the North, as well as the Aborigine Forum, which is a network of independent experts on indigenous people of Russia, and the Fund of Indigenous People in Solidarity, Guatami. The first item that we discussed was linked to the pandemic that we are living through now. We were discussing its potential impact on Vision 2050, if there will be more diseases of this kind. When discussing this issue, we formulated a recommendation of promoting the approach of united health, which is the concept that speaks about the interconnectedness of the health of animals, ecosystems, and people. Even 10 years ago, we already heard the message from the WHO and the FAO that spoke about the potential threats of disregarding our common health. So we believe that we should put all the efforts primarily on protecting this ecosystem and the health. Apart from that, we spoke about the participation of IPLCs. We believe that indigenous peoples should be considered the center actor in carrying out all of the activities that will be held on the national level. Now, many noted that in the last years, indigenous peoples could not participate actively. They were not promoted. Their rights, unfortunately, were not promoted. In one of the webinars, there were representatives of NGOs from France, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and other countries, from their governments too. And we spoke about key goals and concrete targets that are linked directly with indigenous people. We believe that it's very important to consider the legal rights of IPLCs over the conservation and wildlife management on their territories, waters, and lands in accordance with traditional practices and customary and sustainable use, including in strictly protecting areas. Today, Ramiro already spoke about this, and I would like to mention it again. When it comes to protecting the strictly protected areas, we should also speak about how it would influence the lifestyle and the livelihood of IPLCs. There are already countries that are introducing protection of strictly protected areas without allowing for people living in these areas. We also spoke about the impact of climate change on biodiversity, because a lot of Russia is lying in the Arctic Circle and the far north. And of course, given this fact, we should consider not only Target 7, but also Target 5, since they are interconnected and interlinked. I would also like to say that apart from the obvious negative impact of climate change, we also can track its impact on the food systems, on the traditional management of resources, and the sustainability of indigenous peoples as actual peoples. And the last point I would like to mention is traditional knowledge. I believe that this is the cross-cutting theme of the CBD, and it should be mainstreamed across all future programs of work. We should understand this and we should lobby this topic on the national level. Apart from that, we should never forget the upholding of free, prior, informed consent. Apart from that, I would like to say that we used to have a working group. And in the framework of this group, we were talking about what we should work on in the next 10, 20 to 30 years, given the Article 8G and other issues linked to Indigenous people. So we've picked up on these issues too. So I would like to identify the main issues. First of all, we should speak about the inclusion and promotion of rights of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples should be the center actor in carrying out the program of the GBF. In the 4 meetings that we've held, we've only discussed this number of issues, but we are going to continue this next year.
Mr. Tonio Sadiq to present the outcomes from the North America Dialogue. Mr. Sadiq, raise your hand. Yeah, you have already. And press the button on your left screen to give the floor. Perfect. You are there. Welcome, Sadiq.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucy, and greetings to friends and colleagues here today. I'd like to present on the dialogue that took place in the North America region on November the 24th. We met just once for 3 hours, and I want to say that there was tremendous overlap with the key messages presented by the other regional coordinators so far, which is really great to see. The North America session was dominated by participants from Canada, but included several from the United States, as well as a few others from other regions. Now, we don't have the time to fully capture all that was said in our dialogue session, but I'll summarize a few of the highlights. Conservation efforts around the world have historically infringed on the rights of Indigenous peoples through further dispossession and displacement from their lands and waters. These displacements often enable activities that contribute to biodiversity rather than prevent it. This approach to conservation by nation states is rooted in a colonial dichotomy that divides nature and people, and is less effective at achieving conservation objectives than approaches exercised on lands actively stewarded and governed by Indigenous peoples. While there is support for international calls for more ambitious conservation targets, explicit actions must be taken to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples as parties commit to protect 30% of land and waters by 2030. One such action could be to include the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the Post-2020 Framework. The standards and obligations found within the UN Declaration should be woven throughout the fabric of the framework. And for this and other reasons, the engagement of Indigenous peoples with respect to the framework and across the Convention requires its own set of targets, monitoring elements, and indicators to recognize the distinct rights of Indigenous peoples. Biodiversity flourishes where Indigenous peoples have control and governance over their lands, waters, territories, and resources. In this regard, Indigenous peoples have an inherent right to access their traditional foods and control the food production systems of their territories. This is affirmed by the UN Declaration. As such, Target 13, for example, regarding mainstreaming biodiversity values, should also include an explicit reference to food sovereignty and to traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge systems, as we are beginning to say in Canada. Finally, we must ensure that Indigenous peoples do not continue to bear the disproportionate burden of disturbances through loss of land, livelihood, culture, and identity. The COVID-19 pandemic has provided us with an opportunity to pause, reflect, and realign our core values with a renewed understanding of the interconnectedness of the world. Understanding this global COVID crisis from a resilience-based perspective demonstrates that while our natural, social, and economic systems will ultimately adapt to major disturbances, we must work to strengthen their self-repairing capacity to avoid putting them at further risk and thereby challenge the biodiversity recovery that is so needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sadiq, and thank you, Tonio, very, very much for that summary presentation. You kept quite good time too. And now, without wasting a lot of time, let's go to Chrissy Grant, who will be presenting for us the dialogue from Pacific, the outcome of Pacific. So, Chrissy, raise your hand. Yeah, you are there. You've raised your hands and then press the button so that you can be, yeah, perfect. Go on, Chrissy. You're welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good evening to well past the midnight for me. We had a Pacific region webinar on the 30th of November, so that's just a couple of days ago. We had 43 participants. And our main views and recommendations, they were very passionate speakers in what they had to say. And the messages that came through was that Indigenous peoples have the rights, has a right to manage and control their own land, territory, waters, and resources for conservation and sustainable use. And there is an intrinsic connection between people and knowledge. It is not possible to separate it as it is at the moment in Target 19. The GBF should ensure to continue to undertake action on their lands, waters and territories than to disregard them and let it all go to havoc. So the Pacific small islands and the small developing islands states have has realised that, you know, sort of the IPLCs has the knowledge, the wisdom, and the ability to survive and deal with such things as COVID, and balancing that with being able to actually put food on the table for the family. And so the IPLCs want concrete targets that recognise Indigenous peoples' rights as the custodians of the land, territory, waters and resources. The financial and technical support to IPLCs, they are the people who provide important contributions and they know how to integrate into their living today. However, the loss of marine biodiversity for IPLCs in these island states means the loss of their food, medicines, culture and knowledge. And it needs to be protected, and they need to protect the oceans and the recognition of IPLC's marine customary use rights. The Global Biodiversity Framework need to be relevant for their daily lives at local levels, or it will not achieve its targets. There was great support also for Indigenous education in their own languages, so encouragement and support for IPLCs to continue to organise and celebrate, and awareness of their cultures, traditions and languages in schools and much broader through the general public. So that was the outcome and the recommendations from the Pacific region.
Thank you very much, Chrissy, considering what time it is there right now. Thank you so much, and thank you for your team in Pacific for giving us those recommendations. And now I'll go back to the Indigenous Women and Biodiversity Network, and I've requested Adamu Dija, if you could raise your hand up so that you could be given the opportunity to read again. And there you are, and then you press the button. Yeah, perfect. Go ahead.
Thank
Dija.
you again, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to present for Indigenous women. The meeting took place on the 28th of November 2020, and it was attended by women around the world, all the regions of the world, that is Africa, Latin America, Asia, Russia. And presentations were also done by women from these regions of the world, including presentations from LPOs, IPs, and IISD secretariats. During the discussion, the women indicated that they were the masters and managers of land, territories, and resources. Therefore, their role is very crucial in the post-2020 global framework. They also highlighted issues which are very concerning and very critical according to the presenters. The issues, that's the views of the women, which were the importance of traditional knowledge to indigenous women, and also the call for the protection of indigenous women right defenders. Also, land tenure and the use of resources were also highlighted, and the equal access to information of indigenous women. They also highlighted the use of effective indigenous solutions to indigenous problems and the importance of food security to indigenous women. The following recommendations were proposed by indigenous women, which includes to safeguard traditional knowledge and values and the respect of free, prior, informed consent, to recognize and respect indigenous women as crucial partners in the conservation, protection, and enhancement of biodiversity, to protect indigenous women human rights defenders and their knowledge of biodiversity, to guarantee indigenous women effective participation in the designing, implementation, monitoring, and reporting of post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And finally, to provide technical support and capacity building to indigenous women. In conclusion, the indigenous women are looking forward in achieving the 2030 mission and the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adija. That is very good and great that you were able to put those notes again together and present to us. And I think I thank you all because it's really been very good. You've kept time and we've been able to catch up quite easily and to get all those recommendations that have come. And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Viviana Figueroa from the IFB to present an overview of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Viviana has been taking the journey with us all through all the regions to help us try to collect these particular recommendations and see how we can be able to reframe them and also to be able to present to them. Viviana, please raise your hand and so that, perfect, you are there. Welcome, Viviana.
Sí, muchas gracias, señora Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. It is a pleasure for me to present on behalf of the Forum and the Indigenous Women to present this long process of discussions within the regional webinar series on the different representatives of indigenous peoples in all the regions around the world. This process has started way before the actual webinars in June and July. we identify some priority items and issues that we believe are quite relevant. And the ones that I'm going to be presenting to you today are those items that reflect what our brothers and sisters, regional coordinators, have been already mentioning in their presentations. First of all, the International Forum, the Post-2020 Global Framework has to be set on the target 18, which is the minimum standard. And we should not go back in that sense. We do not want that this new plan or global framework goes beyond those standards. We believe that in order to move forward on the new global framework, we require a human right approach, and we prioritize nature protection and human rights of the brothers and sisters defenders of nature, which we believe could be an important advancement that should be reflected in the document, that it should be based on evidence. The global framework on biodiversity, which was published last year, and the report on biodiversity, the one that we have also prepared as Indigenous people and local community representatives, show our roles and contributions. So it is not simply a discussion or statements, but we are showing the real contribution on our work for conservation, which is key for the years to come. We also believe it should be important to have a coherence among the different goals and objectives. Sometimes it feels that they're not quite well interconnected, and we believe that that's not good. It should be a strong link between objectives and goals. We should also have a culture based approach, the intrinsic connection between nature and culture as an element to be introduced along the whole framework, since we believe that we indigenous peoples are the one promoting a specific approach on biodiversity, and also when says on the protection of indigenous knowledge and local communities, like on to respect the free, prior, informed consent processes and share benefits when using the indigenous knowledge. A critical point that we have not discussed so far within the framework or the protocol of Nagoya, and we believe that in the years to come should also be an item that has to be discussed. This next slide, please. Well, the whole framework is important for indigenous people, but especially we think that those targets related to conservation are quite important. Should have a legal recognition or an increase of the legal on the territories, lands of indigenous people, and to promote community-based protection areas. Those should be inputs for targets 1 and 2 of the zero draft of the global framework document. Another important input is the use of the sustainable use and customary use has to be recognized or emphasized in targets 3, 4, and 8, but also in other related targets refer to the management and use of of species. We as indigenous people need to ensure the customary and sustainable use of biodiversity, and it has to be supported because that will be reflected in the conservation of our traditional knowledge and the use of plants and animals that sometimes are protected on special laws. of course, because of some specific protection laws, but we need to ensure also the protection of our knowledge and other resource management for wildlife, which should be also recognized within the specific related targets. Targets 19 and 12, which are related to equitable access and benefit sharing. We believe that even though this target is focusing on benefit sharing, there are some challenges such as the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol in issues related to traditional knowledge associated to genetic resources, the ones that require the free, prior, informed consent of the peoples and communities, and also their fair share and the benefit sharing process. It is important to highlight that the current targets do not specify the right of indigenous people to receive those benefits as is it's stated in the Nagoya Protocol, and thus have to be explicitly written within the new framework. In the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol, in the participation on benefit sharing and a broader approach, not only in the use of genetic resources, but also in the use or our input and support on conservation of biodiversity. Regarding Target 19 on information and traditional knowledge, we believe it's confusing. The wording is confusing. We still need to understand what a meaning of availability of traditional knowledge to decision makers and public, because as the Nagoya Protocol and other different documentations, everything or has to go through the consent of indigenous people and all the, of course, different resources uh, required. So we do not really understand what will be the implications on that specific wording. They should also add a target explicitly focusing on the legal recognition, respect, and promotion of indigenous and local knowledge, innovation, practices, and technologies. On Target 20, equitable participation and governance, the, the rights on resources, we believe it is important in this target and in many others, and probably in the whole cascading approach, this human right based approach, especially the one related to the human right to a healthy environment, because that will help on our efforts of conservation. It should also include the full and effective participation of IPLCs of indigenous women. So we are highlighting not only the equitable participation, but also the full and effective participation of IPLCs and indigenous women. We believe that this process has to be not only in accordance with national obligations, but also in accordance with international obligations, such as the ones coming from the United Nations of Indigenous Peoples' Rights and the um, ILO Convention or the Climate Change Convention, among other international conventions. The concern on the interconnectivity between climate change and biodiversity, and how we reflect the contribution of traditional knowledge to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And another target we believe is important is the resource mobilization target 18. These financial mechanisms should support directly IPLCs. IPLCs are contributing largely to the preservation and conservation of biodiversity, even more than other organizations. Private organizations are receiving resources to work on biodiversity protection, but not the IPLCs. Therefore, we believe that this new framework should recognize the key role of IPLCs by setting some sort of goal or target that financial mechanisms to really support IPLCs. Thank you very much, Ms. President.
Now you had quite a lot to present. I want to thank you. Sorry, I want to thank you. I want to thank you all for your presentation. It reflects the work made at the regional level and sets the points for our discussions. Now we close this agenda item and the public session to this dialogue. Before we move to the next agenda item, I would like to thank our viewers on the public YouTube channel for following this morning session, and invite you to join us on the December 3rd at 9 in the morning, Montreal time, when we will present the conclusion